Awesome. So we're going to break it down. But before I go into this thing, I got a little bit of a non-PowerPoint, I hope that's okay, thing here about domestic violence. It's a couple of points that I want to sort of talk to the group about. Number one is that we've got to understand that domestic violence is a social problem based and perpetrated by existing societal attitudes and social relations which reflect gender inequality and promote male privilege over women. Now that can be quite hard to accept, but what is male privilege? And I think a great way of giving an example of male privilege is simply that I might go to a concert by myself, and I can do all the things that I need to do and go home and be relatively safe with that. Where a lone woman or a lone female walking to the same concert doing the same things could easily get harassed and picked on. Like there's an assumption because she's a woman she's a target, but because I'm a guy I'm not. Then that's a societal sort of perception on the gender inequality there. So male privilege is the fact that I'm male. I can do whatever I like. I've got the strength and I can determine lots of different things, and it's really quite an interesting thing. I haven't got a lot of time to. That's probably a whole lesson on its own about male privilege. But the thing is because we're still hanging on to some old values around men have a lot of power and women still are quite subservient in a way. And that's changing, and I'm thankful for that in a way because I believe that's an erroneous viewpoint. So it's really, really important that we understand that. Domestic violence in majority of cases is perpetrated of men. I've sort of made that point. We acknowledge that occasionally a man may live in fear of his female partner and that similar behaviours may be perpetrated in same-sex relationships. Same-sex relationships, again, it's a speciality. It's sort of like you've got to know what you're getting involved in and know what you're talking about. You've got to be trained to do that. So again, I'm not trained in that field, so I'm sort of going to just mention it. And then if you're interested in working with same-sex couples that do experience domestic violence, then maybe it's something that you need to talk to your organisation supervisor or look for some PD on that. Okay, so domestic violence is not an outcome of individual pathology, deviance or personal deficit. Again, it's sort of like we're not making excuses. Just because you got something going on in your life doesn't mean that you perpetrate violence, because another person with the same thing doesn't do it. And so it's really about attitude, it's really about social responsibility. Domestic violence is not relational, that is, the abuses are not a result of relationship problems. Women and children have the right to live safely and free, fear within their own homes and access to services that support them. Women and children who are victims of abuse or violence are not passive recipients. Overtly or covertly, their responses represent resistance to the abuse, and I might, if I've got time, sort of touch on that a little bit later on. There is more perpetrators of abuse than the abuse he perpetrates. Men who abuse family members are not proud of the abuse they perpetrate, and domestic violence is the sole responsibility of the perpetrator. It is not a mutual process in which the victim of the abuse may be held partially accountable. So those last 2 points. When I work with men, especially in the group stuff, when you get to that point of talking about this, there's actually a greater sense of shame and a lot of disbelief around what they've done, and that disbelief is just to avoid the responsibility and a little bit about minimizing the abuse. And so most men, I should say, I shouldn't generalize too much, but most men will not be happy about talking about the abuse because it reflects poorly on them and they feel really embarrassed or a lot of shame around that. And the second point is that the perpetrator of violence is responsible 100%. The woman is not responsible in a domestic violence situation. He controls his behaviour like everybody else has to control their behaviour. He is responsible for what he does in that moment. So if he chooses these things, he is totally responsible for them. And no amount of excuse is going to make that better. The only thing that's going to make that better is honesty and him owning his behaviour and making choices around that. Okay, so hopefully that was helpful. So can we just go back up, sorry? Yeah, thank you. So physical assault occurs So I've sort of talked about that. There's some examples there: pushing, slapping, punching, choking, and kicking. Sexual assault, we sort of touched on that a bit as well. So forced sexual contact activity. Forced in the context refers to the individual who are physically coerced to participate or who are not in a position to say no as a result of fear, threats, or intimidation. So if you want to know more information, there's the Sexual Assault Resource Centre website there, but there's probably other websites where you are or other agencies that probably define that a little bit better than what I can. Also contains more detail, so yeah, absolutely. Verbal threats, so threats, put downs, insulting, and shouting. So can we go to the next slide? So we've got emotional and psychological abuse, mind games, manipulation, humiliation, making the person feel worthless or no good. Social isolation, we sort of touched on that, keeping the victim away from friends, family, work, or other social opportunities. Financial abuse, controlling the money and the decisions around its use, taking or limiting money, stealing. Spiritual abuse, keeping someone away from their places of worship or forcing them to participate in a spiritual religious practice they do not want to be involved in. I'll just get a drink, hang on. Cool. All right, so we've got these really clear definitions on what can occur. And now in counselling, if you do have a person who is a victim of domestic violence, one thing we've got to be really careful about is that we don't make them feel guilty or we don't make them feel responsible for what's happened. But what we need to do in counselling is really work hard into establishing some sort of empowerment for them, that they, and be really sensitive around how that's going to look. The term we try and use is resistance. So what are they doing in a way that's resisting in the domestic violence? Look for things that they're doing already that we would consider called resistance in that, and work with them and support them in that process of resistance. And so hopefully we can unpack that a bit. If you're working with a perpetrator, you really got to get them to understand that what they're doing is not okay, that it is actually damaging their relationship that they somehow care about, maybe, that it's a damage in the relationship with their kids, and it's not actually doing any benefits for them, because in the end of the day they could actually get a criminal record, or they could lose out of their family, could end up in a divorce situation. They could lose a lot of things if they don't actually start taking the line of understanding how their behaviour, their choice of behaviour is actually impacting on the relationship.